Hey guys, so we're back reading Black Marxism. I apologize that it's taken so long. However, we are on chapter 11, and then we have the conclusion, and then we're done. And this is a really short chapter. It's on Richard Wright. My grandfather loves Richard Wright. I have 2 of his books, but I have not read them yet. I have Black Boy and Native Son. But let's go ahead and get started. Richard Wright and the Critique of Class Theory. Marxist theory and the Black radical intellectual. In one sense, the first systemization of Black radical historiography was constructed by figures such as G.W. Williams, J.J. Thomson, Du Bois, James, and Padmore for precisely the complex reasons suggested by James when he wrote on revolutionary leaders. They had directly profited from the cultural advantages of the system upon which they mounted their ideographic attack. As the heirs of Black petite bourgeoisies, they enjoyed in the order of things the intellectual beneficence of the ruling order from which they posited their critique. Meaning they were like coming from a privileged position, and they're receiving the benefits of those privileges, and then from that position, that privileged position, critiquing the system. You know what I mean? For example, Du Bois, he was the first Black man to go to Harvard and receive a PhD. And then, before he's come to Jesus moment, I mean, everyone has one. Hopefully, everyone has a come to Jesus moment in which someone recognizes how, like, your perspective is created by your environment, right? And like, even for myself, my perspective, I'm coming from a background, a middle class background, because of the work of my mom. I'm receiving those benefits. I got a job at 15 because I wanted a job, not because I had to get a job to survive. You know what I mean? Or my mom was able to sign my sisters and I up in a bunch of different activities. Cheer, all-star cheer, that's expensive. That's a, you know what I mean? But that's a privilege that I'm taking for granted. Or, for example, my grandfather, he used to be a sharecropper. When he was a kid, he was not allowed to go into the library, or that's risking violence and death because of segregation, right? And so he would receive books on a truck, and it'd be like old, tattered books. And then when my sisters and I were growing up and we lived with our grandparents, he would take us to the library, and that was and we never had that fear of violence going into a library. That's a privilege that's taken for granted. You know what I mean? Like that type of thing, in which I have those, right? Okay. Oh, but like recognizing the privileges in which you have, but also like understanding privilege in an oppressive society, blah blah blah. And then for Du Bois particularly, he had like this talented 10th, like classist, elitist kind of perspective he did, perspective. And then as he developed more, he became more of like a Pan-Africanist type. He was like with people and he was like, oh, you know what I mean? Okay. Where were we at? A less obvious process fueled their rebellion. Ambitious and accomplished in the very skills that were understood to qualify them for leading roles in bourgeois society, which naturally demarcated extraordinary individuals, in parentheses denominators, from the ordinary populace. Their loyalties to the existing order were contingent only on its consistency. Inevitably, so saying like, they're loyal to this bourgeois capitalist society their loyalty to it is reliant on its consistency. And then when the racial order kind of is like, actually, you're still Black, they're like, oh, wait a second. Generally speaking, inevitably, when racial order subverted their experience of the universals of Western civilization, they were confronted with but 2 alternatives: to bitterly endure the cynically indulged illusion, or to attempt its realization. Obviously, when these figures chose the latter, it was not a choice characteristic of their class. Can I give I want to give an example. No. Well, if it comes up in a discussion, we can talk about. I don't know, girl. Shut up. Anyways, sorry, I'm in my head. Still subject to what James had described as the inherent political vices associated with their social origins, their seduction by those aspects of Marxism that were owed to the sources of its genesis is understandable. Marxism's intellectual power and pedigree, its promise of a hidden truth, its open opposition to an insidious social order, its alternative mapping of the historical origins of the ruling classes, which they had come to despise, and its identification with the underclasses, made it an almost irresistible companion. Pause. So I've been putting my notes on Patreon. I have not published the page because I was like, oh, let me put them on Discord, but then I had to pay money, and girl, I don't got money like that. Yeah, it's $2.99. So I was like, oh, okay, I can put it on Patreon because I did not know that I can do that. So I've been scanning the notes, putting it on there. But my problem is with YouTube, I haven't downloaded I deleted my videos. That'll be for another time. Anyways. An almost irresistible companion. Moreover, Marxists were under no obligation to minimize what the total thrust of bourgeois thought was orchestrated to deny, that the natural social order tended towards instability and chaos. On the contrary, Marxian logic composed a historical order from the anarchic wrenching. Did I say that right? Anarchic? Anarchic. So yeah. Don't make fun of me. Wrenching social forces within the capitalist world system. Marxism was, and in parentheses, and remains a superior grammar for synthesizing the degradation of labor with the growing destabilization of capitalist production and accelerating technological development, the increasing resort to state coercion mediated by bureaucratic rationalism, and the strangulation of whole regions, in parentheses, most of them formerly colonies, through pricing mechanisms, market manipulation, monopolization of advanced tech. Girl, this is going on right now. Like, when when you like read something and you're like, oh wow, I can see it happening, something in history, and you're like, oh, I can see it happening right now. Like, that's what this book and like a bunch of other books are like. It's like, oh wow, okay, right. I mean, sometimes, often I feel crazy. Not crazy, just like, sorry. Market manipulation, monopolization of advanced technology, the international organization of production, international banking, military assistance, and the stultifying dependencies of monocultural economics. Marxism, too, implied that it was the particular privilege of the revolutionary intellectual to comprehend this deeper, extra existential order. And in the generation of these black intellectuals with apparent finality, Marxism was confirmed in its historical authority by the Russian Revolution. This last identification, though, was to prove to be an ambitious one. In the minds of the black intellectuals, within a quarter of a century, the significance of the Third International had substantially degenerated. It's like a party, kind of. Not really. Third International. Comintern, Third International, abbreviated, also known as the Third, was a, okay, the Third International was a political international which existed from 1919 to 1943 and advocated for the world communism. Association of National Communist Parties, founded in 1919. Though it stated Britannica. Is that a good website to look at stuff? Oh. It's not working, so let's not use Wikipedia. The American Historical, Marxist Internet Archive. Let's go to that one. Okay, the Third International actually emerged in 1918 when the long years of struggle against opportunism and social chauvinism, especially during the war, led to the formation of communist parties in a number of countries. Officially, the Third International was founded at its first Congress in March 1919 in Moscow, and the most characteristic feature of this international, its mission of implementing the precepts of Marxism and of achieving the age-old ideals of socialism in the working class movement. This most characteristic feature of the Third International has manifested itself immediately in the fact that the new Third International Working Men's Association has already begun to develop. Okay. Cool. Within a quarter of a century, the significance of the Third International had substantially degenerated. For some, like Padmore and later Cox, international communism, in parentheses Stalinism, was simply another deceitful Western invention. For others like James, it was its own perversion. Finally, for those who were to share Du Bois's experience, it seemed merely a convenient means of protest. However, detached from the communist movement, Marxist theory could retain important capacities. Period. Oh my god. I get my cousin, she's 4 years old. I get her to repeat words, and period is one of them. It's really funny. Notwithstanding its weaknesses, there was in Marxism a critical discourse to which no bourgeois ideology adequately responded. Capitalism's global regularities of war, expanding poverty and exploitation, the concentration of wealth, and the extension of repression persisted. Yeah, girl. Bourgeois thinkers displaced these endemic phenomena with the notion of termed resolvable dysfunctions. Marxists correctly declared they were no such things. It's like you can't fix the problem with the problem. Like, the problem is capitalism. You can't fix it, right? That's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm getting from this. Anyways, there was, however, much more to these Black radical intellectuals than their class origins and the contradictions they experienced consequent to the racial castes of the Western civilization. More profoundly than scientific Marxism could suggest, they were an element of a historically emergent social force, the Black radical movement. Girl, this is how my... Ooh. Did I scratch the page, or was it just my... I need to cut my nails. And though intellectually disciplined in such ways as to oppose its conscious realization, because think about it, like bourgeois society, like our education system, like the miseducation of the Negro, it's conditioning us to, it's socializing us in a white supremacist, heteronormative, patriarchal, capitalistic society. We are being socialized in the society to to support Euro-American, right? Right? And then when you kind of have that come to Jesus moment, that's when you're like, oh, shit. Oh. Unless, like, you have someone at home to tell you, because, like, typically if you have, like, challenging narratives at home, like, if your parents are teaching you something that's, like, challenging, like, racist ideals. No, like, think about it. Like, in the sense of, say there was a, like, girl, that'll be for a discussion. Listen. But more like, you know what I mean? Like, when you're socialized in a society, and then... Girl. Okay. Maybe we'll read that book. Know Thyself by Naeem Akbar is a really good book. I'll say that. Let me just read that sentence again. And though intellectually disciplined in such ways to oppose its conscious realization, their ideological nurturing as blacks prepared them for its eventual recognition. Oh, like Du Bois in Double Consciousness. He was like, he's growing up in the society in like a class, like in a class of his peers that are in the same socioeconomic class, but then he's realizing they see, like, I know who I am, blah, 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 but I know how you see me as a black man. Well, for Du Bois, you know? I think there was someone else that coined triple consciousness, or said something about that, like going further when talking about black women. I have a feeling it's Alice Childress, but I can't remember right now. But when we get to that book, maybe I'll remember. Or if I read a different book, if I go back to a different book. Anyways. Okay. Oh, but yeah, he also... Girl, I apologize. And though intellectually disciplined in such ways to oppose its conscious realization, their ideological nurturing as blacks prepared them for its eventual recognition. It is possible to see, even in such westernized intellects as James and Du Bois, that the historical force of the black movement was the more powerful influence. Period. Even their discovery of Western radicalism proved to be insufficient. As we have seen, it became necessary to both of them to attempt to bring Marxist theory to bear on a historical phenomenon for which its analytical vocabulary was inadequate. Because, like, Marxist theory is born out of European thought. That's where it's insufficient when it comes to describing black revolt. Because Haitians weren't reading Marxism. During the Haitian Revolution, they was like, you know what I mean? Now, there was more communicated if you're black, you may understand what I'm talking about. You know, the winds, the up and down. Right, you get it. Hopefully. But we talked about this in the previous chapter where they were using mechanisms such as, like, people say voodoo, Vodun. But right, okay. From the moments of these efforts, neither Du Bois, nor James, nor Padmore, nor Cox could sustain a commitment to orthodox Marxism. But there were also others in whose work a similar contestation could be discerned. But there were also others in whose work a similar contestation could be discerned. There's similar perspectives, people coming to similar conclusions. Okay, sorry. Others emergent from black societies and in search of an articulated opposition to Western racism and bourgeois society. One of these, Richard Wright. is of particular interest. Unlike those upon whom we have already focused, Richard Wright was not of the petite bourgeoisie. His roots were in the black peasantry of the American South. His encounter with Marxism and the communist movement was largely unmediated by the cultural misdirections that accompanied the intellectual awakening of middle-class black men and women. His childhood and adolescence in Mississippi, subject to the most direct exposure to racist brutality and brutalization, provided him little appreciation for or expectations of bourgeois society and its culture. He came to Marxism for reasons that were fundamentally different from those of our previous subjects, and when he withdrew, he was different too. His insights into his experience of the communist movement and into Marxist thought suggested an alternative penetration into the relationship between European radical thought and the historical configurations of the black movement. Period. The ambiguity surrounding Wright is, in part, a consequence of his own intellectual odyssey. More precisely, it is a consequence of his public honesty about the voyage. It was a journey that took him from Marxism and through existentialism and finally to black nationalism, a journey that could be retraced bibliography. Read the word, girl. Biographically. From his membership in the American Communist Party in the early 1930s to his death in France in 1960. But another and equally important source for the undefined character of Wright's legacy is the several and remarkably extensive campaigns of vilification launched against him by the American left, the American liberal intelligentsia, and American bureaucrats. These range from the literary attacks on Wright by writers such as James Baldwin and the political assaults of figures like James Ford, Ben Burns, and then editors of Ebony, the deliberate distorted reports in Time magazine on Wright and others, the machinations? Doesn't sound right. Machination, a plot or scheme set up by Todd. Machination of the Central Intelligence Agency. Ooh. Oh. So I guess it was Todd. By the CIA. Dang. Wait. Oh, okay. And threats from once powerful, but now almost forgotten anti-communists like David Skene. Schine. It appears to be a fair statement that though these distinct and, in some instances, opposing political factions had rather different interests in the destruction of Wright's influence on American politics and literature, they did concur on the desirability of the suppression of his work and ideas. In any case, the result was the same. Wright's self-imposed geographical exile was transformed into an intellectual and political isolation. Moreover, some of these same forces sought further retribution from Wright by filling his life in Europe and Great Britain with harassment of both petty and terrifying dimensions. It was intended that Wright realized the full consequence of criticizing American domestic racial policies and attacking American foreign policy in the Third World. Ooh. Yet despite his detractors and their sponsors, despite the established and powerful political and cultural authorities of American society, some of Wright's work and ideas survived. The reemergence of Wright's importance in American thought may appear at first ironical. And many of his critiques are now rather thin shadows of history. But more accurately, it is the result of the social and historical contradictions of American capitalism and its particular social order. In the midst of the Black consciousness and nationalist movements of the 1960s, the seemingly irresistible dictates of the market compelled the republishing of The Outsider, 1965, Native Son, 1966, Black Boy, 1966, Eight Men, 1969, and later American Hunger, 1977. They were works that spoke to a generation that Wright did not live to see but had anticipated. Significant, too, was the emergence of younger and equally militant black writers and playwrights, among them John A. Williams, Leroy Jones, Ed Bullins, Melvin Van Peebles, and Ishmael Reed. Much of their work had fallen quite easily into what one American critic, Robert Bone, had called the Wright School. For the Wright School, literature is an emotional catharsis, a means of dispelling the inner tensions of race. Oh, period. Their novels often amount to a prolonged cry of anguish and despair. Too close. I realized that I was yelling because of the air. Sorry. Prolonged cry of anguish and despair. Too close to their material, feeling it too intensely, these novelists lack a sense of form and of thematic line, except for the fact that Bone had already announced the death of that school 20 years earlier. By the late 1940s, the vein of literary material unearthed by Richard Wright had been all but worked out. The market for protest had become saturated. It does appear that Bone was a bit premature. More remarkable, however, than the sheer survival of Wright's work is the theoretical and analytical power of his ideas. The achievement of Wright's with the simultaneous with the stimulus of historical materialism and psychoanalysis fell much closer to an emergent European literature. There's a lot of names. Why does it look like that? Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Cosetler, Lucas, Luka with an accent, CS, Marcuse, Kolakowski. I apologize if I pronounced any of those names wrong, that I did pronounce those names wrong. In the post-Second World War period than to any American fashion. Like many European left intellectuals, Wright was moving beyond classical Marxism and the Marxism inspired by Lenin in order to come to terms with a world constituted of material and spiritual forces historically unique. To come to terms. I need to get new pens. Wright's reach, consequently, can be said to be much longer than that implied by the terms employed by many of his American critics. He was never merely a racial novelist, a protest writer, or a literary rebel. Indeed, much of his work was a direct confrontation with the leading ideas and national systems of contemporary Western political and social thought. His arena was the totality of Western civilization and its constructive elements: industrialization, urbanization, alienation, class, racism, exploitation, and the hegemony of bourgeois ideology. Importante. His work thus constituted an inquiry. Okay. Wright's persistence in his investigation of Western society was an important factor contributing to the achievement of a certain consistency in his work. As an artist, as essayist, as critic, as political activist, it is clear that he arranged and rearranged many times the elements making up the phenomenological display of Western development. He knew the names of Western experience, but was less certain of what he knew of their nature and their systemic and historical relationships. There were questions to which he still had to find answers. Was the working class a social reality? Could class consciousness supersede racism as an ideology? Was the party the vanguard of the proletariat? Was Marxism more than a critique of capitalism? These were some of the issues to which Wright had not found satisfactory answers in organized and organizational politics. Ultimately, it would be because of his particular skill for transforming theoretical abstractions and constructs into recognizable human experience that it became possible for him to make those distinctions between dogma and reality so important to his development. Theoretically and ideologically, Wright came to terms with Western thought and life through Black nationalism. However, the basis for his critique of Western society was his experience of the historical formation of Black peoples in Africa and the diaspora from the Gold Coast. Am I saying that diaspora or diaspora? How do y'all say it? From the Gold Coast to the Mississippi Delta. Physically and intellectually, he was drawn to attend those same forces that produced the critical inspections of W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, and C.L.R. James. As Michael Fabre puts it, Wright's originality then is that he completely understood and often reiterated that the situation of the black in the 20th century, and in particular during the crucial period from the Depression to the advent of Black power, was exceptional. These years saw the awakening of the Third World, and with it the enormous mutation of our civilization. The liberation of colored peoples of the world is the most important event of our century, is a refrain that runs throughout Wright's work. The same message delivered half a century before by Du Bois did not have the same existential dimension. Wright had not created these forces that were transforming Western society, but it was his intention to give these events a meaning independent of those interpretations bounded by the interests of Western civilization as articulated by its intellectuals and ideologues. Still, there are some who have argued that Wright fulfilled little of his promise. Harold Cruse, among them, has written that Wright was so ideologically blinded by the smog of Jewish Marxist nationalism that he was unable to see his own clearly. Damn. That Wright had not understood that the classics of Marx and Engels were written not for the proletariat but for its intelligentsia, and finally that he could not gather into himself all the ingredients of nationalism to create values and mold concepts by which his race was to struggle, live, and die. Here, then, are two of the several interpretations that attach to Wright's significance. The first places him within a tradition of Black radical thinkers. The second expels him from that same legacy. In the following pages, we shall examine which of these two summaries of Wright's work is more appropriate. Ooh, tea. And this is where we're going to end because we're at 33 minutes. And then the next is the novel as politics. Oh, that one's not that long. Anyways, thank you so much for listening and bearing with me and being patient with me. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And let me know what type of books y'all are reading and what y'all are getting, because I definitely need some more books. But anyways, happy Black August. Okay, have a good day. Thank you.